Hi, everyone. I'm here today with Asher Lovy from Xhaka. And today we're going to speak about a very pressing matter, but also a very important topic, something that we should be talking about all the time. Asher, thank you so much for being here, for taking the time to speak about this subject. It's very important. Thank you.
No problem. It's my pleasure.
Of course. So I actually discovered your page after, unfortunately, the whole Chaim Walder scandal. So what was it about this case specifically that received so much, I wouldn't say international attention, but so much like Jewish attention?
So this case is unique in the sense that in many abuse cases, the abuser might be somebody who's known in the community, even widely known, but it's very rare that so many people in the community have such a deep connection with the person who's accused of sexual abuse. And in the case of Chaim Walder, within the last 15, 20, 25 years, everybody who's grown up within the Haredi community has not only read his books, but loved his books, because he was discussing issues in the community that people were facing that nobody else was talking about, not in the Haredi media, not in classrooms and yeshivas, not in shuls. Rabbanim tend to shy away from it. And his books were addressing it in a very pure way that connected with people and made them feel seen if they were going through similar issues. So this is somebody who was universally loved and was universally seen as a figure that was a comfort to so many people. I would say that I was saying earlier this week or last week to people who were reaching out, trying to process this whole thing that's happened, that in my mind, this is the single biggest trauma experienced by the international Orthodox community in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Wow, because he gained so many people's trust. And I do understand that in one of his stories, or a few of his stories, he actually spoke about child sexual abuse. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was at least one story that didn't explicitly spell it out, but for the children who were reading it, who had experienced abuse, they would understand what the story was talking about. And for parents who were reading it, they would understand what the story was talking about. So it kind of gave a springboard to parents who needed to talk to their children about it. It gave them a way in. You know, they could read this story from Kids Speak and then talk about it.
Yeah.
And parents could ask their children, you know, has anybody ever done anything like this to you? If anybody does do anything like it to you, you should come talk to us. And it would also give parents a way to relate to their children if God forbid, you know, one of their children was sexually abused.
So that's why it's so traumatizing, because it's not like he wrote like a science book or a math book, or if he was known for something in engineering. He was specifically known to be a child therapist as well as a children's author who was beloved by many. So that's why it's very, very traumatizing. So I think the question that people have now is, if this could happen to him, if Chaim Walder was a sexual predator, and he was able to use his platform, his charm and charisma and his position to abuse other children, then are there other Chaim Walders? Are there other people who are like this?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to assume that the frum community has less of a prevalence of sexual abuse than the secular world. There are some studies that have indicated that it might be more. The data isn't great. It's a little bit hard to study the prevalence of sexual abuse in the community because the community resists study for many, many reasons, because of the stigmas involved, because they're scared of what happens for their chances of shidduchim. People don't want to talk about it, but there's very good reason to assume at least that the prevalence is equal with the general population. So yes, there are other Chaim Walders out there, and that's one of the reasons why Za'akah exists, is to help people, you know, respond to sexual abuse and get healing for themselves, to seek justice. In general, most of the cases aren't nearly as high profile, and aren't nearly as widely felt. In many cases, there aren't, 22, 25 victims speaking out about it publicly. In most cases of sexual abuse actually aren't having to do with a public figure or somebody in an institution. Most sexual abuse cases are people who are either known to the victim or are within a family or a family friend, the general family circle. And many of these abusers, exist in the community just as they exist everywhere else. They're just not nearly as well known as Chaim Walder and don't cause as much of an international stir. But it's definitely something that we have to, as a community, address and take seriously and be vigilant of, because yes, there are many other Chaim Walders. This is not a rare situation.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, one of the things that trouble me about this whole situation is where does it come from? Meaning, like, some people say it's trauma that's passed down, meaning if someone was sexually abused as a child and they don't take care of that, then they're going to go on and abuse other children. So it's like passed down trauma. But where does it originally come from? Is it a mental illness? Is it something genetic? Like, I don't understand I don't understand it. If you can explain it a little bit, I don't know.
You're not the only one who doesn't understand it. There really isn't a lot of great research on this, because and one of the reasons why is because any research into what causes a predator to prey on their victims is you rely on their own testimony about it. When researchers go to, let's say, prisons or treatment centers to interview pedophiles or sex abusers about why they did what they did, you're relying on their own self-reporting of the events, and people are notoriously unreliable about themselves. So not necessarily about facts, meaning that this happened or that happened, but in terms of their own internal narrative, especially when you're dealing with someone who may be feeling guilty about it and maybe trying to project the reason why they did it onto other people or factors. So it's very difficult to understand exactly. There isn't any one place that it comes from. There are a number of places, and I want to start with the example that you gave. There is this misconception in popular culture that someone who is abused, barring any outside intervention, is very likely to themselves and go on to abuse. It's not that doesn't happen. There is a certain percentage where that does happen. And there's a documented percentage where that happens. Many abusers were themselves abused, but just because that's true doesn't follow that the inverse of that is true, that somebody who was abused is necessarily going to go on to abuse. So there definitely is something there, that there are people who are recreating what they know and are recreating the dynamics that they know, but the vast majority of survivors of sexual abuse are never going to go on to abuse anybody. So that's one potential cause, where people are playing out what they've experienced. There are also some people who are sexually attracted to children, some of whom are exclusively sexually attracted to children. Some are sexually attracted to children in addition to adults. And then there are people who are in it more for the power and control, that they feel that's what does it for them, so to speak, rather than some sort of inherent sexual attraction to children. So there are all sorts of reasons why people do this. It's really hard to pin it down on one.
Right, but I'm wondering if it's like if it's an experience, a traumatic experience that they had, or is it something that like someone is born with, where they socialize and at about 10 years old they realize they're not attracted to people the same age as them. They're attracted to like 2-year-olds. It's very confusing.
Again, it's really hard to know. It's really hard to know where it comes from, because, like I said, there isn't any one source of it. For some, like I said, it's an inherent thing. They are sexually attracted to children, and that's all they're sexually attracted to.
Right.
Meaning that's what it takes for them to get sexual pleasure. Then there are some who are playing it out for because they can. There are some people who are opportunistic abusers who will abuse not only children, they'll abuse adults as well. It seems like Chaim Walder falls into that category, I would say, because he was, in addition to sexually abusing children, he was also coercing women into sex with him. He was having all sorts of affairs on the side. So I would say that he might fall into that category. Obviously, I'm not any qualified professional to say that definitively, but in my experience, that's what it would seem. And then, like you said, there are people who are playing out a previous trauma. I don't know. I couldn't tell you if that's what was happening in Chaim Walder's case. I know it's happened in other cases. And actually, one of the clearest examples of that are often when you see children who sexually abuse other children. Obviously that's something that needs to be dealt with very seriously. You know, you can't just shrug it off because it's one child abusing another. But often that's a red flag to indicate that the child who's committing the abuse has himself or herself experienced sexual abuse of their own, and that needs to be addressed as well. So it definitely does happen, and it does bear mentioning, since I brought that up, that typically the younger you intervene with that sort of thing, you know. So let's say you have, and these are cases that I've dealt with actually. Let's say you have a 12-year-old abusing a 9-year-old, right? That doesn't mean that for the rest of their life that 12-year-old is going to be a sexual abuser. The sooner you get that kid into treatment and address what clearly happened, you know, somewhere traumatic to that child, the more likely it is that that's not going to be a continuing issue.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying that, actually.
Sure.
Well, Asher, what about the victim? Are there some people who are susceptible to being molested or abused? Is there a type of victim?
So this is going to dovetail with one of the other questions that you're likely going to ask me, which is, what are the circumstances that allow for sexual abuse? And most consistently, I would say that the conditions that lead to an environment where sexual abuse is likely is where there is an air of impunity, where an abuser thinks that they could get away with it, right? And in some ways, those factors are communal, meaning if the community is not one that discusses sexual abuse, they prefer not to think about it. They tend to side with the alleged abusers rather than the victims. You know, in such a community, an abuser knows, well, I'm more likely to get away with this, so you know, I can abuse more readily without having to worry about it. It's kind of the same way with who's most likely to be abused, because in that vein, there are certain types of people who our communities just don't care about. For example, if you have children from broken homes, whether that's divorce or whether that's the family, you know, one of the parents is ill or one of the parents is dead, you know, if there's any sort of stigma against that child that's going to work against them, mental health, if the, you know, kid is struggling with drugs, if the kid is in some other way marginal, then that child is more likely to be preyed upon, because the abuser knows that, you know, well, if it comes down to my word against theirs, the people I'm around are more likely to trust me than trust that kid or that family. So often you'll find, and again, this is not definitive, but you know, often you'll find that, you know, kids who are LGBT in a community that doesn't accept them, kids who are struggling with mental health, kids who are struggling in school, kids who are, you know, from quote unquote broken homes, you know, those are the kids who will most likely be targeted by abusers, because they know that most likely they're going to be believed over the victim if the victim says anything.
And that's very true. I see it everywhere, where like the excuse that people have is like, this person is mentally ill. This person doesn't know what they're talking about. They're deranged. You're believing this person who's sick, who's mentally unstable, over this charming guy, this guy who's a leader of the community. You see it all the time. You hear about it, and it's sad, because that argument can be believable in a way. Like, yeah, maybe this person is making it up. That's one of the reasons that's spread around when there is abuse in the community, that this person is making it up for attention, for their 5 minutes of fame or whatever it is. So I'm glad you brought that up. Could it also be that an abuser, you know, preys on a victim who comes from a good family, a typical nice family, doesn't have any, it's not marginal, doesn't have any issues. And because of the abuse that they're enduring, it causes the person, the child, to have mental health issues, possibly causing them to, have a different sexual orientation. Could that be it too?
So those are two separate questions. I'm going to address them one at a time.
Okay.
I'm going to address your second question first. I just want to get it out of the way. There's nothing I've seen to support the idea that sexual orientation changes as a result of sexual abuse. It's more likely to be the other way, meaning that a child is professing or exhibiting a certain sexual orientation, and the abuser knows that that's going to count against them, or the abuser knows that that's going to make them marginal, so they prey on that child rather than other children. To address your other question, I'm glad you brought it up because I was actually going to follow up if you hadn't. Yeah, there are lots of children from otherwise, I didn't mean to imply that victims are uniformly, or consistently from damaged homes or from, or suffering from mental illness. It just happens to be, those are, I guess, the statistically most likely the children to be abused. But exactly as you said, there are plenty of children who are abused from, otherwise normal homes and otherwise normal situations. Who, as a result of their sexual abuse, start to act out, start to, underperform in school, start to have questions about Judaism, start to take drugs because they're self-medicating to get away from their trauma, start to not relate to the people and the environment around them, so they seek out other environments, whether that's, a group that people would call like, the bad kids or whatever, the kids will start to seek out environments that are more accepting of them, that they feel more comfortable in, that the community isn't necessarily comfortable in. And at that point, when they disclose sexual abuse, then the excuse often is exactly as you said. Oh, well, you can't take this kid seriously. Look at her, or you can't take this boy seriously. He's dropping out of yeshiva. There was a very prominent case in Williamsburg, Brooklyn in 2012 from a therapist named Nehemiah Weberman. He was actually unlicensed. He was used by the community to provide unlicensed therapy to children who were acting out in school, especially girls. And there was one girl from a regular family, from a fine family, who had been acting out in school. And she was sent to Nehemiah Weberman for treatment, and he was raping her from the age of 12 to I think the age of 15. And obviously that didn't improve her situation. She ended up being kicked out of school, and she went to another school that had a social worker who was a mandated reporter, and she told her story. And that's eventually how it got reported initially. And at trial, and not just at the trial, but also sort of in the community surrounding the trial, the community gossip mill around the trial. One of the things people were saying was that, oh, look how she dresses. She's had boyfriends. She's not a virgin. There's all this stuff that they're saying. And, that's a convenient excuse. But, if you're going to neglect a child who was sexually abused, and you're going to send them to, and you're going to continue sending them to a rapist to treat them, obviously they're not going to get quote unquote better. They're not going to become more like what you want them to become. So it's very easy to use that as an excuse. I used to work at a drop-in center in Flatbush called Our Place. I worked as a volunteer there for about 2 years. I was told by the people who ran the place that about 85 to 90% of the children there had experienced sexual abuse. But if you would talk about this particular drop-in center to regular people in the community, if they didn't have any relatives who went through it, they would say, oh, these kids are bums, they're drug addicts, they're, completely devoid of context. When really what was happening is that these kids were mistreated by the community, and then they were thrown out for not fitting the community ideal. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
You can't throw your children out and ignore them if they're sexually abused, and ignore their mental health issues, and ignore their struggles. And then when they come forward and tell somebody about what they've experienced, say, oh, they don't count. they don't matter. Look at them. They aren't part of our community. We don't have to have any empathy for them. That's like killing your parents and crying you're an orphan. It's completely wrong. It's completely, it's completely unacceptable. And unfortunately, our community likes doing that a lot. Our community likes pretending that we don't have issues of mental health, we don't have issues with suicide, we don't have issues with drugs, we don't have issues with sexual abuse. And the only reason why we're able to continue telling ourselves that lie is because we're very good at throwing out every child that we don't want to count as part of our community. Well, they're still our responsibility.
Yeah. Are there specific communities that have this more? Like, is this all Jewish communities? Which Jewish communities are thriving in this area and which communities can do better? I'm not talking about like naming specific communities, but the type of communities.
Yeah, so again, it's hard to discuss prevalence in the Orthodox world in any type of community because again, we're a community that resists study. But I could say in general, there are different types of communities that in my experience would lend themselves more to sexual abuse rather than others. Before I continue, I think it's important to note that sexual abuse happens everywhere and that cover-ups happen everywhere. And it's not something that you could reduce to zero. Unfortunately, we live in a world where that's going to happen. But there are different communities that can mitigate some of the risk. For example, there are communities in the Orthodox world where it's normal for an organization to be invited into a school to provide teachers, parents, and students education about children's body autonomy, proper boundaries, safe and unsafe touch, how to react in potentially unsafe situations, communities that at least in this education and at least in theory emphasize that abuse is to be reported immediately to the authorities, that survivors are to be believed and supported. Now, again, that doesn't always happen, even if you have this education happening in schools, and even if you have this environment, there's always going to be abuse, and there's always going to be attempts to cover it up. But if you take a look at differing responses in communities to allegations of sexual abuse, let's compare the reaction to the Chaim Walder case to the public reaction to Bill Cosby, right? Mm-hmm. So Bill Cosby is actually a great example to compare to Chaim Walder because he was a very strong part of the childhood of generations of American children, and beloved by generations of Americans who grew up loving him. In the wake of the allegations against Bill Cosby, for the most part, obviously there were exceptions, but for the most part, you didn't see reactions in the general media saying it's lashon hara to talk about Bill Cosby, saying that we're responsible for hurting Bill Cosby. When Bill Cosby hobbled into court on his walker, we weren't told that, oh, we're the ones who damaged his health. No, it was very clear. It was very clear in the public conscience that what Bill Cosby had done, he had done to himself, and that any penalties that resulted, he had done to himself, and that any backlash he experienced were the direct result of the sexual abuse he inflicted on his numerous victims. In the Chaim Walder case, you have Rabbanim like Rav Tal in Israel saying that the entire thing is libel. It's not libel. Once you have that, first of all, let's talk about something that likely also would have come up. The incidence rate, I'm generally opposed to rebutting those ideas by pointing out the number of victims, and I'll explain why. Mm-hmm. It's important that people don't get used to the idea that sexual abuse only matters when there's 25 victims. The incidence rate of false reporting is somewhere between 2 and 10%, according to our best research. It's a little hard to measure, but that's our best guesses, according to FBI and Justice Department statistics. The higher end of that spectrum tends to skew toward custody battles and divorces. But again, even in those cases, the incidence rate is pretty low of a false report. And it's important to distinguish when talking about false reports between something that failed to win in court, meaning a case that was either dismissed or where an alleged abuser was acquitted. It's important to distinguish between that or, where a victim will recant or refuse to cooperate. It's important to distinguish between that and a definitive finding of falsehood. A false report should only be counted if there's a definitive finding of falsehood. And that is very rare. There are many reasons why victims might recant, why they might not participate. There are many legal reasons why a victim may not win in court. None of that means that the allegation was false. It just means that it didn't get far enough in court. That's all it means. So even when you're dealing with one allegation of sexual abuse, you have to remember it is very rare for a false rare for false reports to happen. Okay. In the Chaim Walder case in particular, since that's what we're talking about, once you're getting through that many levels of vetting of these allegations, meaning there were many people who spoke to Aaron Rabinovich, and only 3 of them were published because they made it past the vetting process. Again, that doesn't mean that the rest of them are false. It means that those 3 stories were vetted very carefully, because newspapers have a desire just as much as the rest of us do not to get sued. They have legal departments that vet anything that might be controversial, and they have a responsibility to make sure that they aren't responsible for libeling someone. So it's been vetted there. It was then vetted by the Beis Din of Rav Shmuel Eliyahu. At this point, to say that Chaim Walder is being libeled is ridiculous. I mean, you're living in a fantasy world if you think that this isn't true. So again, getting back to my earlier point, you didn't have, again, in the general response of the public in the Cosby case, prominent figures in American culture getting up like Rav Tau and saying the whole thing is Alila. It's right. The response was concern for the victims and a desire to seek justice. Whereas you contrast that with what happens in the Haredi world, and many times in the Orthodox world in general, where you have people saying, Lashon Hara, you aren't allowed to talk about it. This is not true. Innocence until proven guilty requires us to pretend that the allegation didn't happen and that this person is potentially dangerous. Like all these things, and we see the result of such responses. Not only does abuse continue to happen, but unfortunately, as in the case of Shipra Horovitz, victims see what the community thinks of them and unfortunately take their own lives. So I would say in a community whose default response is to identify with the abuser against the victim, either because they find it shameful or because they find it uncomfortable to think that this is a problem in their community, or because they love the abuser or whatever other reason, in such a community where victims know that that's the response and therefore they don't speak up to police, you're going to create an air of impunity where abusers are going to abuse more.
Yeah, which goes back to that question about what communities are more susceptible to this.
Right. People have to look at their communities and see, what is our messaging on sexual abuse? Are we making it clear that sexual abuse should be taken seriously? Do we make it clear to victims that if they come forward, their allegations will be taken seriously? Now, taken seriously doesn't mean that we have to immediately throw someone in jail. Obviously, there's a process, and that should play out, right? But there are certain precautions that we could take. For example, if a teacher is accused of sexual abuse in a school, you don't necessarily immediately have to fire them, but taking the allegation seriously means you have to immediately put them on administrative leave until there's either a resolution in court, or if there can't be a resolution in court because no one's willing to go, until there's a fair and as independent as possible investigation done transparently to determine whether or not this allegation has merit, right? That's called taking it seriously. Taking it seriously also means that if somebody's accused of sexual abuse, maybe they should, don't let them around children for a while. And the example I usually use is, if you were all these people who like talking about Lashon Hara and say we shouldn't talk about allegations until someone's found guilty in court. What if you were hiring a babysitter and you hired this babysitter and they worked for you for a month, and then after a month you found out that your best friend knew that person was accused of sexual abuse and didn't tell you? Wouldn't you be furious? Yeah. And everybody I ask this to says, yeah, of course I'd be furious. So why are people angry about that on a personal level? but they refuse to address it on a communal level. So are we doing that? Are we taking the allegation seriously and taking the proper precautions? Are we making sure that the victims know that they're going to be supported, whether that's materially, financially, emotionally? Are we doing what we can to ensure that people that we know who enable abuse are no longer respected in our community? So if someone is covering up for a sexual abuser, if there's a Rav of a shul who insists on giving aliyahs to the sexual abuser, are we calling that person out? Are we making it communally unacceptable to enable sexual abuse? Are we, as I said, educating our students the correct way? Are we emphasizing that reporting should be to police and not to rabbis? Like, these are the things that we need to be doing in order to make sure that sexual abuse doesn't continue in our community. We're seeing a lot of statements now from a lot of people and a lot of rabbis. We support survivors, of course, we support survivors. What is being done communally, really materially, not just, platitudes? What is being done really to ensure that our communities are safer? That's the question that we need to be asking. And in communities that are doing it right, I would say that sexual abuse is less likely to happen. In communities where the response is more like the Haredi response to Chaim Walder, I'm willing to bet that there's more abuse happening in those.
Mm-hmm. So it's the communities who are reacting in the wrong way. They tend to be mostly Haredi communities, or are there other communities besides Haredi communities that also don't have the proper tools to combat this, or to speak out against an abuser and to support the victims? Is it most likely in Haredi communities, or are there other communities like this?
I mean, I'm only I only exist within the context of my own experience and expertise. So I can only comment on I understand that most of the audience that's going to be hearing this, from what you said, is the Persian community, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. So I don't personally have a lot of experience, so I can't speak to that. You'd be able to speak to that more, but. I've seen. I grew up in Borough Park as a Haredi person, and I no longer am part of that community. So I can speak from my experience, I guess, on the Ashkenazi side of it. There are always, so broadly speaking, I would say that the Haredim, and the further Haredi you get, the more this is a problem. But this also happens on microcosms of communities. So if you have, let's say, one particular school where there's a very strong cult of personality around one person, and that person is the sole arbiter of who is and isn't an abuser, and is the sole arbiter of how abuse is handled, within that community too, there could be a lot of abuse going on that's covered up for. So for example, I mean, just to give one example, I can't get into too many specifics because my lawyer isn't sitting here next to me to stop me from saying something that's going to get me sued. But in my experience, outside of the Haredi community, one example of a community that has a lot of sexual abuse that tends to get covered up because the leaders there just aren't inclined to do anything about the people in power who are either abusing or enabling it, is in Baltimore. You have many prominent cases of sexual abuse in Baltimore where there are many known abusers in the community that nobody does anything about. There are therapists in that community who themselves are abusive, who are known in the community, who are then considered authorities on sexual abuse. And nobody does anything about it there. But that's a community that that believes in reporting in theory, that educates their children in theory, that talks about sexual abuse as a problem in theory. But because the community is the way it is and has the leadership it has, there's a lot of sexual abuse and a lot of sexual abusers that gets covered up, and that's very difficult to speak out of, because if you speak out in that community, you're going to face intense backlash.
Exactly.
I've seen death threats leveled at parents who have, in public death threats leveled at parents who have dared to speak out about their children's sexual abuse. So that's an example of a community where, you have a very specific thing going on there, that lends itself to sexual abuse. So like, yeah, Haredi communities, broadly speaking, have this problem, but it's not just there. It's important that people pay attention to the communities around them also and see what the dynamics are over there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so where does Za'akah come in? Your organization, can you just tell us a little bit about what Za'akah does in terms of preventing sexual abuse and providing support for survivors and seeking justice for the victims as well?
So our philosophy is that we do what we do well, and we refer to other organizations that do what they do well. So in terms of education, we refer to outside organizations because they do it better than we can do it. One resource that I consider there are two resources, actually, two resources that I would consider the gold standard for policy setting and child education in this. And those are the Bayar group, run by Rachel Bayar. Yeah, and she's fantastic.
Yeah.
And the other organization is Sacred Spaces, run by Shira Berkovitz. Both of these organizations do incredible work. And parents, schools and institutions, let's say schools should be inviting these organizations to build policies in their schools and educate the children, parents, teachers in their communities about sexual abuse. But if the schools aren't doing it on their own, I would urge parents to get together and insist to the school leadership or to the shul leadership that those organizations be brought in, because that's really a big step in prevention. In terms of what we do to address sexual abuse, we started out, Xhaka started out in 2012 protesting the Internet of FIFA. For those who are not familiar with what that was, it was an organization, it was an event organized by many different communities within, broadly speaking, the Haredi community to essentially come together in Citi Field and declare the internet banned. Clearly it hasn't worked, but because look at us now. But the position of Xhaka's founders, and I'm not one of Xhaka's founders, I took over in 2016. The position of Xhaka's founders was, it's a little ridiculous that the community is going to spend millions of dollars promoting an event as asinine as banning the internet when there's so much sexual abuse going on and the community devotes zero resources to it. So they were going to protest outside that. Before that happened, the Nefemi Weberman case that I mentioned earlier happened. And there was a fundraiser held by the community on behalf of Nefemi Weberman that was advertised very widely in Borough Park in Williamsburg, that ended up raising $500,000 for the now convicted sexual abuser.
Oh my God.
The protest was held outside, obviously. Yeah, the protest was held outside, obviously out of disgust. And that's really what kicked Za'akah off. Was we wanted to make sure that the victims in that case saw that it's not just the community, like we see you and we're here for you. So we started sort of as an awareness group and as awareness and pushing back against the community narrative about sexual abuse. By 2016, when I took over, we had started working on the Child Victims Act, which passed in New York in 2019, and extended the statute of limitations both criminally and civilly for child sexual abuse, and also opened a 1 year look back window for old cases that had been previously time barred in civil court because too much time had passed. It opened a 1 year window during which any case, regardless of how old, could be brought. That was eventually extended another year due to COVID, and all in those 2 years, about 11,000 cases were filed in total in New York. About 250 of them were within the Jewish community broadly, meaning all denominations. So that's what we were most immediately involved with. We were also involved in an effort to pass what's called Erin's Law in New York, which mandated abuse prevention education in public schools. It was on our agenda to then go back and have it extended to private schools as well. Then COVID happened and kind of got in the way of that. But it should be mentioned that any private school in New York that is looking to have that abuse prevention education, and this is true in New Jersey also, that's looking to have that abuse prevention education taught in their school, Erin's law provides funding both to public schools and private schools on a federal level. There's a federal grant that's tied to any state that has passed Erin's law that makes federal money available to any private school that wants to apply for funding to help defray the cost of this education. You just have to reach out to your local school board and talk to them about it, but that funding is also available. So we worked on that. The Erin's Law bit was meant to be on the prevention end, and obviously the Child Victims Act was meant to be on the justice end to help survivors get justice. The other things that we do are we participate in educational events like this actually, to wherever possible educate parents and communities about the best ways to prevent and properly handle sexual abuse. We also provide a service where, if during regular business hours or through email or, a survivor reaches out to us for help,
Yes.
they've been sexually abused and they need to know what to do next. We don't provide any direct services because, again, there are other organizations that do it better. So what we do is we'll listen to a person's story, hear what they want to do, and then we'll refer on to the best organization that can help them. So, for example, if they're looking for someone to help them go to the police and file a report, we'll put them in touch with an organization like Safe Horizon in New York or Xhaka in New Jersey, who will provide an advocate to go with them and sort of hold their hands and be with them through that process. If they're looking for a lawyer to file a civil suit, we have a legal team that we work with that we refer to, who are trauma informed and very good at not only not only prosecuting these cases, so to speak, but also making sure that the survivor feels that they're that they're understood. So we'll refer to legal resources, we'll refer to mental health resources if we can. If someone needs help getting therapy, we'll try to refer them to the best organization that can give it to them if they need it for free. We also partner with other organizations that can make specific referrals to specific therapists based on different circumstances. And we also, and this started during COVID, we run a separate, it's kind of separate, but it's a mental health peer support hotline for Shabbat and Yom Tov.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's only available for Shabbat and Yom Tov?
Yeah. For the time being. At some point in the future, it takes a lot more resources to run such a hotline during the week because people have to work.
Right.
You either have to have many more volunteers, or you have to have paid agents who can sit at the phone, and that's either very expensive or very costly in terms of human resources for volunteers. So that's a much more difficult undertaking. But yeah, for Shabbos and every Shabbos and Yom Tov, night and day, we have volunteers who are trained in peer support. So it's not a crisis line, but anybody who feels that they need to reach out for any mental health reason, for any reason whatsoever, we're available by WhatsApp and by phone. Our number is 888-492-2524. Again, every Shabbos and Yom Tov, if you feel you need to reach out. And we operate under the rabbinic guidance of Rev Yosef Blau from Yeshiva University.
Mm-hmm. That this would be sort of like a pikuach nefesh in a way, where even if someone is Shomer Shabbat or obviously Shomer Chag, if they're in a dire situation where they feel like they're feeling helpless or they can't do anything, they would be allowed to call your hotline on Shabbat to, in a way, break Shabbat to help themselves mentally.
And I want to emphasize, because this is a question that we get often, like, at what point how bad do I have to be to reach out, to justify calling on Shabbos? You don't have to be in crisis. The goal of our hotline is to prevent you from reaching that point. So if you're experiencing anything, depression, anxiety, intrusive thoughts of suicide, obviously if you're in active danger, reach out to, we aren't a crisis line, so please reach out to either crisis text line by texting help to 741-741, or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. But if you feel yourself struggling with any of these things on Shabbos or Yom Tov, you don't have to be at the point where you're in crisis. We're here to prevent that from happening. So please feel free to reach out.
Okay, great. So from my understanding, from based on what you were just saying, Za'akah is basically kind of like the middleman, the place to go to if you are obviously a victim of sexual abuse, if you're a survivor of sexual abuse, and those two are different, right? Like if you're a victim, that's if you're currently being abused, and if you're a survivor, that's when the abuse ended. Can you just
Well,
clarify that? Because I feel like the language is a little bit confusing.
so it's more of a self-identification thing, and there are some people who have experienced sexual abuse who don't want to be called survivors, and there are some who don't want to be called victims. It's a personal choice. The generally accepted nomenclature is survivor when you're referring to someone who has experienced sexual abuse in the context of in the context of active abuse that's happening from a person. We tend to refer to them as victims, but it's not, there isn't like one set in stone rule. I would say if someone is referring to someone who has experienced sexual abuse, just generally speaking, survivor is the preferred term.
Okay, great. So someone reaches out to you and let's say they need a lawyer, they come to you, you guys will help them find a lawyer, or they need mental health services, you help them find a proper therapist or social worker or an organization that can help them with that.
Yeah.
Then you said that there's other ways that you seek justice through different laws like Erin's law, and anything else that you can provide for them besides legally, mentally, mental health resources, I mean.
We also partner with a support group, with an online support group called the Jewish Survivors Forum, and their website is jewishsurvivorsforum.org. And I would recommend, if anybody is a survivor of abuse and doesn't specifically need a therapist or a lawyer or anything like that, but just wants a community of people who will understand them and support them, that's a great resource, and I would recommend reaching out to them. The only direct service we provide is through the Shabbat and Yom Tov hotline, because again, like, our approach is we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. But one thing that a lot of people need help with, there are a lot of resources out there, all sorts of resources. There are safe houses, there are organizations that will help with with people pay for rehousing people. There are organizations that will help in transportation in domestic violence situations. There are organizations that will help with food. There's all sorts of organizations that will do all sorts of different things, and it's very overwhelming for someone who's going through an abusive situation to have to do all that research.
Yeah.
It's taken us years to compile our list of resources, so I can only imagine someone going through it on their own, right? So we try to make that part easy. If someone calls us up and tells us exactly what's going on, we discuss what they need, and then we try to get them to the best available resource, and we give them the best advice. In some situations, unfortunately, there isn't necessarily something that we could do, but we try to give the best honest information to give people a realistic idea of what sort of help they can get. And we make sure not to overpromise, and we do what we can to get people help, just so they don't have to sit there and try to figure out exactly stand on one leg and learn the entire universe of resources that are available to help them.
Right. I was curious to know, as you were speaking, who reaches out to you? Do the victims themselves reach out to you? Do they reach out to you when they're in the middle of their abuse, while it's happening, or is it after? Like, when does that happen? Is it the parent? Is it a friend?
That's an excellent question, actually. The vast majority of people who contact us are people who have already experienced abuse and are out of the immediate situation, because and one thing that's important to, and I'm really glad you brought this up because it slipped my mind to talk about, but one of the things to understand about sexual abuse is that on average it takes a very long time. It could take decades for a survivor to feel comfortable coming forward talking about their abuse.
Wow.
And there are all sorts of reasons for that, either because the trauma is too visceral, they sometimes want to just try to get on with their lives and and just move on from it. And then they realize later that the trauma is still with them and they need help, or it's because they're too scared to come forward, which very relevant. That's why the survivors, most of them didn't, try going to police, because they were scared of what would happen to them, the backlash, what would happen if people found out that they were Mosrim, that they were informers. So most of the people who reach out to us fall into that category. They experienced sexual abuse, years prior, and now they're looking to get help or they've been in treatment for a while and they just need another option, or they've decided that now's the time to seek justice and they reach out to us for legal advice. We do sometimes get calls from people who are actively experiencing abuse. It's rare, because again, it's rare for survivors to reach out on their own, but we do sometimes get calls like that, and then we advise people. We try to pair them up with, if they need somewhere safe to live, then we pair them up with an organization that's going to be able to take them in and provide them safe housing. We try to
if
give
anyone
advice.
who's listening to this, if anybody who's listening to this who maybe suspects abuse going on, whether it's with their child or a sibling or a friend or anything like that, are they able to reach your organization to seek help as to how to stop it from happening or figure out what is going on?
Yeah, I mean, if someone suspects that sexual abuse is happening, but their child isn't making a disclosure, like, one of the things that they could do is, bring their child to a licensed therapist who's experienced with dealing with sexual abuse and trauma, and have that therapist, who's a mandated reporter, work with their child, whether that's art therapy or talk therapy, or just talk to their child and evaluate them. And if they suspect sexual abuse, and they're legally mandated to report. I would caution, though, and this is something that may make some people uncomfortable, but there are quite a number of therapists who exist in the Orthodox world who prioritize their obligations to the community over their ethical responsibility to their patients, and therefore will not report sexual abuse if they suspect it. If you're going to go to a therapist that's in the community, I would caution, ask them first, make sure, have a very frank conversation with them about it, and make sure that they understand that you want them to report if they suspect something. Because unfortunately, we've received a lot of reports about therapists in the community who are guided more by their fealty to the community. They believe they're reporting to police as Masir or some nonsense like that, and they won't. So I would caution anybody, just make sure that you make absolutely clear with any therapist that you're using in the community that that's your expectation. There are also child advocacy centers that you could be put in touch with through some sort of larger victim services organization, like Safe Horizon in New York, or Xhaka in New Jersey. There are these organizations all over the country, actually, and at child advocacy centers, what they do is they bring your child in and they have a therapist sit down with them and try to ascertain if and obviously, if your child makes an open disclosure of sexual abuse, or you suspect it on your own, call the police and and report it. And if you're a mandated reporter yourself, don't hesitate to report it. Even if your supervisor tells you that you should go through them first, even if a rabbi tells you that you should ask them first, you should report that immediately to the authorities, whatever that is, whether that's the police or whether that's the child, the child abuse hotline. Just you make sure that you report it. I can't make it clearer that in the case of sexual abuse, we're dealing with pikuach nefesh. Any other considerations like lashon hara, masira, any of that does not take precedence over saving a child's life.
Yeah.
And it's therefore very important, regardless of which Rav tells you that you're not allowed to immediately report to police, regardless of who in your community tells you that you're not immediately allowed to report to police. They're not telling the truth. They're not experts. You should disregard them. Your child's safety is at stake. Go immediately to law enforcement and report it.
Right. Unfortunately, I feel like most people don't have the courage to do that, and they'd rather just deal with it silently, where I think what people are more likely to do is to help prevent it from happening, as opposed to like, if it happens, just deal with it privately, deal with it like with the person itself, and then like get your child therapy or whatever. But what people are more likely to do is to help prevent it from happening. I mean, obviously, this interview is encouraging people to speak up, call your organization, report abuse when it happens, and seek justice. But if someone, let's say, they don't even get to that point, hopefully they don't ever get to that point, what's a message you have for parents or teachers or anyone who deals with kids about how to prevent it from happening in the first place? Specifically parents, I would say. Because
Yeah.
you know, like parents will trust, let's say, their kids to go and get tutored by this rabbi or this teacher. So what are some things you can tell parents who are listening to this right now?
So I'm going to both answer your question and not answer it, in the sense that one doesn't exist without the other. Prevention doesn't exist without reporting. It's the way it is, because you can try to prevent it as much as you want, but it's gonna happen, and that's not to scare people. It's just it's unfortunately there are predators out there, who want to hurt children, and abuse at some level it's going to happen. And again, the communities in which it's going to happen are the ones where the abusers know that there's no punishment for it. So reporting goes hand in hand with that. But in terms of prevention, like I said, schools should be teaching abuse prevention education. And what that consists of is teaching children about body autonomy, that they have a right to say yes or no to who's touching them, and obviously no one's allowed to touch their private parts outside of, very specific situations where, if their parents changing their diaper, the parents bathing them, or the doctor's examining them, in which case the parents should be in the room supervising. But in general, adults should not be touching their private parts. But children also need to understand that they have a right to say no to being touched, and that extends to, and I know this is very shocking for a lot of people to hear, that a lot of people have a very hard time dealing with this. But if a child doesn't want to sit on their grandparent's lap, they have a right not to sit on their grandparent's lap. If they don't want to be tickled by their uncle, they have a right not to be tickled by their uncle. They have a right not to have their cheeks pinched. They have a right to know that when they say my body is mine and you don't get to touch it, that people will respect that. And that comes with, with a whole family agreeing to foster that sort of environment and understanding it instead of getting offended. So body autonomy is important. Setting proper boundaries is very important. And children should know about that. One of the most important things also is making sure that children understand that, aside from what safe and unsafe touches and boundaries and body autonomy is, that they know that they can go to an adult in their life, and talk to them and know that they're going to be believed and taken seriously. And that can't just happen at home, and it can't just happen in school. It needs to happen in the community, because unfortunately, there are some children who are going to be abused by their parents or family members. There are going to be some children who are going to be abused by their teachers. They need to know that regardless of where the thing that's making them feel unsafe comes from, that the adults around them, that they know that there will be an adult that they could go to that will take them seriously, and not try to interrogate them or tell them that it didn't happen or anything, but like take it seriously and deal with it appropriately, whether that's taking them to, a child advocacy center or a trained therapist for evaluation, or whether that's reporting it directly to law enforcement. And in fostering that relationship, and in making sure that people understand that, that we're a community that's safe to come forward to, and we're a community that's safe to report sexual abuse to the police in, and we're a community that takes body autonomy and boundaries and safe and unsafe touch and all this stuff seriously. That's how you really foster an environment of child safety. So you really can't have the prevention without the other piece. Now, if schools won't teach that, because I know a lot of schools won't, there are ways that you can teach it to your own kids. There are programs that are available for not a lot of money from Darkness to Light. It's an organization that has a program called Stewards of Children that helps people educate their children about all of these things that I've discussed. That's not a Jewish program, but it's excellent and it's available to the public. There's an organization called Magenu.
Oh, yes, I know about it.
Yeah, that their curriculum is meant for schools, but one thing that they started realizing was schools aren't going to teach this, so we need to provide it to parents instead. And they're working on a curriculum that's going to be targeted more to parents than teachers. But for now, you can get the box, and it's different age ranges from kindergarten to 8th grade, and you could reach out to Magenu and get the box.
Wow.
And it comes with a complete set of workbooks and coloring books and exercises, and it comes with books to teach you how to teach your kids also. It's meant to, because a lot of parents don't know, and that's fine. They're being educated as well. It comes with materials that you can use to teach yourself how to teach your kids, and then use the exercise. And it's complete. It's there's a concern from a lot of people that this is sex ed. It's not sex ed. That's a whole separate discussion. It's a whole separate issue. This is just to make sure that your children are kept safe. And I would highly recommend to anyone who has children in a school that they can't push into teaching this, go get the curriculum yourself, teach it to your kids yourself.
Wow. This was a lot of information, a lot of useful and important information. Asher, I really want to thank you for your time, your expertise, the valuable education that you just gave us, all of us who are listening right now. So, Asher, can you tell us where people can find you if they're experiencing abuse themselves, or if they've experienced abuse in the past, or if they're suspecting sexual abuse happening in their family or in their community? How can they reach you?
So our website is Za'akah.org, Zaakah.org, and there's some useful information over there, and you can also reach out to us there. Our phone number is 888-4-Za'akah, so that's 888-492-2524. You can also email us at info@Za'akah.org, same spelling. And we're available during business hours. Some of us work after business hours also, but it's a little bit more hit or miss. And if you need any mental health peer support on Shabbat or Yom Tov, we're available at the same number over WhatsApp and by phone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There was so much more I wanted to discuss with you, but this interview it's limited. So
Yeah.
If you want to know more about what Za'akah does, what they're doing God's work for the Jewish people and for the world, I highly encourage you guys to look at what they're doing and reach out. They have a plethora of information, of resources, and really, really thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this interview. This is very important. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Thank you.